Okay, my name is Maya, and I am super excited to talk to you about historical beekeeping practices. We're focusing on the Bronze Age and Iron Age and hives. So, a quick refresher. For most of history, we've been using clay pots or wicker baskets sort of designed hives until 1851 when Lorenzo Langsroth designs these modern-day bee boxes that we know and love. These old skeep hives had a lot of issues that the bee box fixed. For example, you could not harvest honey without destroying a large portion of the hive, and they were susceptible to transmission of diseases. Now, some of our earliest evidence for beekeeping comes from the Caucasus, south of Tbilisi. In 2700 BCE to 2500 BCE, we see pots that have honey residue on them, and from this honey we can harvest pollen to determine what the bees were feeding on. From these examples, we can find that one colony was feeding primarily on roses, another one was feeding primarily on clover. This suggests that either they were producing varietals on purpose of honey, that these um, pots were traded from different regions, or that these pots were harvested at different times from the same hive and that the difference is just based on what was in bloom. Either way, it suggests either a large degree of trade or a more continued hive harvesting practice. In Egypt, we see our earliest example of recorded beekeeping. We can see apiary practices on pottery that is placed in tombs, and tombs holding a great deal of cultural significance and religious significance to the ancient Egyptians suggest that this honey was also very important to them. Honey, in fact, was so important that it was considered a valuable good that you could pay your taxes with, similar to grain. This honey was produced in these long cylinders, and this is a trend we'll see across the Mediterranean. So, for example, in the Levant, in what is modern day Palestine and Israel, we see this urban center apiary, which is very fascinating, housing up to 1 million bees. These hives were very close together and stacked on top of each other. It was a large scale operation that may or may not have had state funding even. Um, there is a lot of religious iconography in the area, suggesting that there is religious significance to the practice as well, similar to Egypt. So this is a early example of urban beekeeping, which is rather fascinating. Moving across the Mediterranean a little bit to Greece, we see similar um, cylindrical hives, but we also see these pots that have handles on them. And the portability of these pot hive designs indicates that these bees were meant to be transported. Transport could mean trade, it could mean pollination services. We're not quite sure, but it does indicate a level of sophistication. Also, going back to our slide before this, the hives in modern day Israel Palestine also had much larger entrance holes. So China is an interesting case. China historically has not needed for much. It is so massive that it does not have much need to trade for with other countries. And due to this massiveness, it also had a large supply of other sweeteners than honey. So it was not as dependent on honey as its neighbors. So our earliest record comes from Hongfu-Mi in the 2nd century BCE. The writings show that beekeeping was uncommon, but the products were still valuable. Now we fast forward a little bit to Zhonghe, who writes of bee capture methods very similar to what we do today. What they would do is place boxes in trees, coat them with wax to provide the bee something to start off with, and then quote unquote bribe the bees with some honey. So this shows evidence of early bee capture methods that I think resemble a little bit of some of our passive capture methods. So there was also the record in this same writing of smoking bees that were in managed hives, which is interesting. Moving on to sub-Saharan Africa, very briefly, we do see a variety of methods with clay, logs, mud, wicker baskets, and stone all in use. In the Sahel, specifically Sudan and Chad, we do see these long cylindrical hives that have been used since 800 BCE. But if we go a little bit further west and a little bit further south, we're going to see these log-based hive designs that are placed on top of trees, which I find to be very fascinating. Um, Okay, and I could not mention this. So Ming Dynasty is most certainly not Bronze Age or Iron Age. This is moving on to early modern. However, it was so fascinating I had to mention it. So in this region called Songjiang, a little bit west of Shanghai, we see advancements in beekeeping technology that resemble very strongly the modern day bee box hive design. So what they did in this region is they had 3 to 4 wooden boxes that they would stack on top of each other, similar to what we do today. These boxes were placed on top of a stand that was, for one, to protect the hive, but also to elevate one of these hives above the other. And this is due to cultural practices in China that very heavily valued ancestry. So in these hives, the first hive of an apiary is considered to be the parent hive and therefore deserving of great respect and honor. Due to this, it is placed on higher ground and the hives around it are placed to its left. This is because right is the direction of honor. So this shows an interesting blending and humanization, a blending of culture and agricultural practices, as well as a humanization of bees. It talks in this document about bees having certain personality traits, which I find to be very adorable. Also worth noting is that they suggest in the winter you should feed your bees chicken intestines, which I'm not sure if we've tried that, but that is something that they think you should do. This book also mentions very briefly that honeybee larvae were harvested for medicinal practices in parts of South China, which is interesting. So, as much as I would love to continue, that is all I have today for my presentation. I hope that it was enjoyable. Thank you very much. And here are the sources that I used. A little side note, if anyone is interested in historical beekeeping practices, I cannot recommend enough the world history of beekeeping and honey hunting. It is extremely extensive and has records from all over the world of honey hunting and beekeeping practices. That was very useful in my research.